Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this Bright Blue event on green technologies of tomorrow, which we're doing in partnership with Drax. For those of you who don't know Bright Blue, we're an independent think tank for liberal conservatism, and we are doing a major relaunch this autumn, and please watch out for that. But basically, our main focus, our policy focus, is on domestic, social, educational, economic, and environmental policy. And obviously, today's debate is very much focused on the environment. One thing you should watch out for is that we have just published a magazine on the effect of COVID on our lives, and that's available on our website and has an interview with Jesse Norman, the Treasury Minister. For those of you who are tweeting, please use the Twitter handles @WeAreBrightBlue and @DraxNews, as well as the hashtags BrightBlue and CPC20. You'll be able to ask questions in the Q&A box, which is to the right of your screen. But before that, we're going to listen to some great speakers that we have on our panel today. So joining us is the Right Honourable Kwasi Kwarteng, who's Minister of State for Business, Energy and Clean Growth. We have Brahic, who is the Economist Environment Editor, Dr. Rhian-Mari, who is the Chief Executive of the Green Finance Institute, Professor Julian Allwood, who is Professor of Engineering and Environment at the University of Cambridge, and Will Gardiner, who is the CEO of Drax. So they'll speak for 5 minutes, but essentially today's debate is about whether technology can help tackle climate change, which is the biggest challenge of this century. So I'm going to start by asking Kwasi to speak.
Hi, can you all hear me? Can you all hear me? Sorry.
Yes, we can hear you.
Good. So just a number of things that I wanted to kick off with. Firstly, I think we should think about the progress that we've made in this space. I think that we don't really reflect enough on that. And then the second thing I suppose I will look at or mention is where I think we are now in terms of technologies for the net zero future, the net zero target of 2050. And then thirdly, I'll talk about whether there are new technologies that we can bring on stream and the developments potentially that we can see. So when we talk about decarbonisation, I think it's really important to understand where we've come from. And people don't pay enough attention on this, but a lot of people, I'm sure, on the panel and others will remember that coal was a very, very big part of this country's story. It was a huge part of the Industrial Revolution, even in our own time in the 1980s, and certainly in the decades immediately before that. Coal basically determined a great deal of our politics, the politics of coal mining, the communities involved, the miners' strike that people remember in the 80s. All of these things were incredibly important and central to the economic life of this country. What's happened over the last 30 years is that really extraordinarily, coal in particular has been essentially taken off the power generation grid, and that's hugely significant. My background academically is in economic history, and I'm reminded sometimes of the fact that in 100 years ago, we were mining 1 million tons of coal a day in this country. There were 1.2 million people working in mines, and we were mining something like 250 million tons a year, something of that order. Even in the 1950s, it was above 200 million tons a year. So the transformation that we've already happened, that we've made, is extraordinary. The transformation that has already happened has been extraordinary. Now, there's clearly a long way to go. And that leads really into the second part of my remarks in terms of where we are today. Since 1990, people will know that we've reduced our emissions by 43%, 45% roughly. And we've managed to grow the economy by 75%. And one of the big successes that we've had has been, as I say, this reduction in fossil fuels in terms of power generation and a more impressive, more steady reliance on renewables. And again, just to quote figures, the offshore wind revolution has been extraordinary. At the beginning of the last decade, in 2010, nobody could have thought that we would be able to get power so cheaply. So even in 2012-13, the cost of power from renewables was something like £150 per megawatt hour. The last auction saw that reduced to about £40. I think it was £39 per megawatt hour. And the capacity has increased dramatically to the point where we are, I think, 35% of the global capacity, offshore wind capacity. 35% of that global number is here in the UK. So it's been a really extraordinary decade, and we have made progress, but there is still a long way. There's still a long way to go. So I've talked about the power generation, and I've talked about the success briefly of offshore wind in terms of renewables, but we still have a major challenge. And the two areas of challenge in terms of decarbonisation are transport, and where we have a policy. We've got the rollout of electric vehicles. We are looking at hydrogen in terms of powering larger trains and modes of transport, HGVs, buses, that kind of thing. And the other big challenge, I think, is the biggest challenge, is the heat and buildings piece, if you like. So heat and buildings, talking about housing stock, where we've got the oldest housing stock in Europe. And the two challenges there are either to reduce, both to increase the energy efficiency of houses, what we used to call insulation, and improve that, and also trying to look at decarbonized sources of heat. So heat pumps could play a part in that, but heat pumps aren't necessarily going to take you all the way there. And that's another area where hydrogen could potentially play its part if it's spread either through blending or through not blending, through just using hydrogen through the gas network. And that's clearly where, so going into my third part of my opening remarks, I mean, that's clearly where there represents a huge amount of opportunity. We're still very much in the early days, the early phase of hydrogen as a potential source of power and a potential source of energy. When I started the job more than a year ago, there were lots of differing opinions about how hydrogen could best be used. Some people even today are quite skeptical about the use of hydrogen. They feel it's been overhyped. Others feel that it potentially can be a game changer in the fight against climate change and in the drive towards decarbonisation. Whatever one thinks, I think the answers aren't going to be known today. And it does make sense to invest and think about how we can best produce and deploy hydrogen in the economy of the future. My views on this hydrogen aspect have changed somewhat over the last 15 months since I've been in the job. I started off being more skeptical about its potential uses, but the more I look into it, the more people I speak to, I think there is a genuine opportunity here. And the last thing I'll say about this is that those of you who know about hydrogen will know that there's obviously the green hydrogen, which is essentially renewable hydrogen produced by electrolysis. And then there's blue hydrogen, which is essentially a product of methane reformation. And the blue hydrogen is dependent on carbon capture, which is, again, another technology that we're looking to develop. And we've pledged as a government to invest in it twice. We pledged in the manifesto, and also the Chancellor referred to it in the budget, which I was very pleased, obviously, about as the Energy Minister. So I think that the hydrogen economy is potentially a big game changer. I think that does represent innovation and some degree of technological development. But what I would like to stress also is that most of the technologies are here already. It's just a question of deploying them and scaling them up in an economic way. We've got hydrogen. We can power vehicles through hydrogen. We know how to produce hydrogen. We know also how to run EVs. We know we've got building techniques to improve the energy efficiency of houses. We've got heat pumps. So a lot of the technology that can take us to 2050 is already there. An exception would be in the case of some nuclear technologies. Small modular reactors and advanced modular reactors are things that we're obviously looking to develop. but a lot of and of course there's the ever elusive nuclear fusion as well. But I think we've got a lot of the technologies that can take us to 2050. I'll leave it there, but and I'm very interested to hear what other people have to say.
Great stuff. Thanks very much, Kwasi. Very sort of optimistic, energetic view on the role that technology has played and will play in the future to help decarbonisation, particularly in the energy sector. So very good to hear. Let's move swiftly on. So let's move now to Rhian-Mari.
Thanks ever so much, Ryan, and hoping to continue that spirit of optimism and positivity when it comes to financing these technologies. Because clean tech clearly has a major role to play, not only in decarbonising our economy, but also in supporting a green economic recovery. So earlier this summer, Goldman Sachs research identified an investment opportunity of up to $16 trillion worldwide by 2030 in the key technologies required to achieve an energy mix that's consistent with a global warming path of 2 degrees. So transforming our petro economy to the electro economy, as recently dubbed by The Economist, through investing in renewables, biofuels, and the power networks and charging infrastructure needed to support an increasingly electrified transport system, plus carbon sequestration, which includes both natural carbon sinks and an increased uptake of carbon capture and storage technologies. The same research also estimated that achieving this energy transformation could lead to net job creation over the next decade of 15 to 20 million net new jobs worldwide. So green infrastructure is both more capital and more jobs intensive than traditional energy, which means for these scenarios to play out, we need both an attractive regulatory framework and a low cost of capital. Climate tech typically requires significant investment upfront for proof of concept, and taking climate tech developments from proof of concept to scale deployment, as the Minister just outlined, that typically requires 5 to 10 years and beyond, which in turn requires patient capital that extends beyond the usual investment horizons of venture cap and private equity. And that's a very different profile to investing in software, for example, where initial investment time horizons are typically 3 to 5 years, upfront costs are lower, and successful concepts can be scaled without requiring significant additional capital and infrastructure. So I guess the question for this forum is what further incentives and investment are needed from the government to increase R&D in green technologies? And given the scale of investment needed, the answer has to involve strategically leveraging government balance sheet to attract private investment at scale. And we already have a powerful world-class case study here in the UK of identifying an untapped, high-potential green technology, building a successful industry from it, and attracting institutional investment to finance it. The Minister already alluded to it, it is offshore wind. 40% of global installed offshore wind capacity sits around the British coastline, and by 2030, it's estimated the industry will support 27,000 jobs. There were key government interventions that successfully de-risked that emerging technology to overcome early-stage investment gaps. And they included: 1, providing incentives in the form of contracts for difference that lowered the high investment hurdle rates faced by project developers and investors. And secondly, establishing a dedicated investment institution to overcome investment barriers and successfully crowd in private capital. And that was, of course, the Green Investment Bank. At the Green Finance Institute, we, along with a growing chorus of other voices across the market, are calling for the establishment of a new national investment bank to support regional development with a clear mandate to operate as a risk mitigation vehicle to address technology and early deployment risks, which it could do not only through supporting individual transactions, but importantly, by also building familiarity within the financial sector by financing multiple deals in these developing technologies that we are going to need for the green and prosperous UK going forwards. Back to you, Ryan.
Thank you very much. Great stuff. And on time, we're doing very well. Normally speakers go over their allotted time, so we're doing very well. Professor Allwood, over to you.
Thank you. I want to address new technology specifically. Today, new technology has played no part in mitigating climate change in the UK or elsewhere. The UK's reductions have mainly occurred due to Mrs. Thatcher's policies on coal to gas and industrial closure, and the combination of renewables and methane capture at landfill sites has done the rest. It's mitigated about 10% of our emissions. But wind developed in Denmark in the 1970s, and my 1970 school calculator is powered by solar cells and still works now, so neither of those are new technologies. So without any question, new technologies will be developed that help with mitigating climate change. But the critical question is how much effect can they have in the 29 years we have left before needing to reach zero in 2050? And there are two issues: deployment rates and taking a whole system view of the technologies. So firstly, about deployment rates. The two examples that keep coming up when I talk about this are the Apollo program's success in putting a man on the moon in '69, and the iPhone, which was introduced in 2006 and has changed the world. So surely we can bring in new energy technologies that fast. But of course, they're different problems. Mitigation requires not that we put one person on the moon, but all of us. It requires that we change everything, and it requires market saturation, not just developing the first sale. And an iPhone, of course, is the next step in a consumer-facing technology that started in the 1940s with computing. If you contrast iPhone sales, for example, with Crossrail, you get an idea of the different timescales of deploying technologies of different types. What we're looking at is an infrastructure change, not a consumer product change. So we've done a lot of work looking at past energy transitions, and we spotted that there are two stages of development before market penetration really begins. Firstly, getting from lab to commercial scale demonstrators, and then secondly, developing the market, the connections, the legal frameworks, and so on. And on average, in our past transitions, the fastest we've gone is about 30 years for each stage. After that, then growth occurs at a kind of predictable linear rate. So to exemplify that, CCUS has been written about for 20 years or more as important, but we haven't got any at scale, so we haven't even begun market development. I think it would be very risky to believe that it will be operating at any meaningful scale in 29 years' time. After then, it's likely that it might be successful. Thirdly, I want to look at the whole systems view. The reality of mitigating climate change is that we have to close everything that emits greenhouse gases by its chemistry or that can't be electrified. So the question is, will there be enough non-emitting electricity? Well, looking at the deployment rates we've had over the last decade, we'll have around about 60% of the electricity we need. But of course, we do have a major problem with intermittency, the timing and availability of supply and its mismatch with the availability of demand. So the discussion about that is, as the Minister said, being dominated by new energy vectors, particularly hydrogen, but also ammonia, synthetic kerosene, and so on. However, they have very high electricity requirements. The round-trip efficiency of hydrogen is about 25 to 30%. So if we have constrained availability of non-emitting electricity, we'd have to sacrifice other demand in order to use those vectors. So we'll need a new market for fair sharing of the available electricity. But actually, it's very unlikely we will have as much energy as we want for some decades around 2050. Later on, of course, we will be able to keep expanding and deploying to relieve that restraint. Finally, Mrs. May's change to the Climate Change Act last year is absolutely right, the only path to planetary safety, and I think we can be proud of it, and our leadership is now being replicated, obviously very prominently with the announcement from China a couple of weeks ago. That's a great opportunity for us to be ahead of the curve. But we should be planning it with today's technologies to guarantee that we can get there, to ensure that we have a safe planet, develop the new technologies like mad. But what we're doing at the moment is conflating R&D and talking about a technology with the reality of deploying it at mass scale. And that's very dangerous. So we published a report at the end of last year, Absolute Zero, which described getting there with today's technologies. The House of Lords had a full debate on that report in February. And if I could work out how to use the chat, I'd post the link to it. And as a result of all the feedback we've had from that, we wrote to the Prime Minister 2 weeks ago from our learning about what we'd learned from lockdown and the Absolute Zero report with 5 recommendations. Firstly, that the UK needs a Climate Mitigation Delivery Authority. Secondly, that we need a National Resilience Commission to plan for stability in the face of unexpected external change. Thirdly, we need different metrics of the efficiency of government spending, because we now realise that the pandemic has cost us much more than it would had we prepared differently. So we need risk-based measures of efficiency. Fourthly, the post-COVID stimulus must not be used for building. There's a great danger that we could build further Heathrow third runways, but instead to stimulate the sectors and skills, very much along the lines of the previous speaker's recommendation on the investment bank. And finally, we must embed social participation in all our plans for delivering zero emissions. We haven't got time to develop and deploy invisible new technologies, so we are going to be involved, and we ought to be communicating that very clearly. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Allwood. Very fascinating stuff. And I was reassured to hear when you talked about us all going to the moon that was a metaphor for the solutions rather than a literal solution itself. Okay, so over to Catherine.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Thank you for having me. My name is Brahic. I'm the environment editor at The Economist. And I think many of my comments will actually sort of summarize what people have said, because I think we're at a critical moment in tackling climate change right now. In fact, as somebody who's reported on this for about 15 years, possibly one of the more exciting moments. The COVID-19 crisis could unexpectedly, in fact, present an opportunity to turn a corner on greenhouse gas emissions globally. But importantly, that's only the case if governments, including our government here in the UK, follow their statements, their very ambitious statements about reducing emissions to net zero by mid-century, with very real and measurable interim targets and actual policy to make it all happen. And I was delighted to hear Kwasi refer to some of those policies. Obviously, future green tech, as many of my fellow panelists have said, is clearly part of that. I'm sure Will Gardiner will be talking about negative emissions, and that's certainly an essential part of that. Climate models suggest that we are very unlikely to reach any of the Paris targets if we don't have deployment of negative emissions at scales. And we've referred also to new fuels, hydrogen, etc. perhaps. But the main point I wanted to make is that it's always tempting to think that there's a shiny new invention just around the corner that's going to fix everything, that we can, in fact, invent our way out of the climate change problem. And geoengineering was on the program. Some forms of solar geoengineering are certainly attractive for that reason. But the reality is that many of the challenges faced in this country and abroad are going to have very or relatively unsexy technological solutions. It's not about inventing something new. And as my fellow panelists have mentioned, many of the green technologies of tomorrow, to borrow the title of this session, in fact, already exist today. So we have electric vehicles, we have wind and solar energy. We, in fact, do know how to suck carbon dioxide out of flue gases and even out of thin air and pump it underground. So if society and governments, including, again, the British government, are going to be serious about going to net zero, going to be serious about their ambitious policy statements, a lot of what needs to be done is going to be the boring, mundane work of transforming infrastructure, of expanding network charging stations so that electric vehicle owners can drive across the entire country, not just across London. And crucially, as the Minister mentioned, of asking ourselves, how do you take 30 million homes, not to mention millions of businesses and premises and public buildings in Britain that are heated by gas today, and in very short order, heat them using renewable power? These sorts of challenges are perhaps less exciting than some of the shiny new techs that we like to talk about, but they are, I'd argue, more important. And I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much. And finally, Will.
Thank you, Ryan. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Great. So I wanted to build on a lot of what we've heard. I think there's a lot of appreciate a lot of the ideas. There's lots of good stuff already been said by the panelists, and so I won't go over that again. But I wanted to focus on how I think one example, and I'm going to talk about bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, can actually demonstrate or deliver a lot of things that people have been talking about. So bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, BECCS, is a form of the negative emissions technology. Some people call that NETS, other people would call it greenhouse gas removal. And as Kathleen mentioned, I think there is a need recognized by lots of different organizations, including the IPCC, including the Climate Change Committee in the UK, for negative emissions in order for us to get to net zero by 2050. And I was actually at a conference last week, at least virtually, or the week before, New York Climate Change Week, where effectively the people sort of upped the dial on this and actually said, this is not really about how do you decarbonize the last pieces of the puzzle, but actually negative emissions is a way to decarbonize faster at lower cost and with less risk, right? Especially if it's done in a competitive way. Right? So the technology we're working on, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, how does it work? So we have converted the Drax power station over the course of the last 10, 15 years to be running almost completely now on sustainable biomass. So it's carbon neutral. If you add carbon capture and storage on top of that, effectively you get negative emissions, right? And negative emissions, it's interesting. There's sort of a couple of commonly expected or understood ways to do this. One is, again, sucking CO2 out of the air, or what is now known as direct air capture, and then at the other end of the spectrum, you have nature-based solutions. And BECCS sort of fits in the middle of that. It's actually significantly more scalable than a nature-based solution. So for example, we could capture 16 million tons of CO2 at the Drax power station if we enabled carbon capture on our 4 different generating units. In order to capture that, for example, in a forest, you'd need a forest the size of Wales to do that in the same sort of capture 16 million tons a year. Right? The other end of the spectrum, some of the new technologies, for example, direct air capture, numbers that people talk about, the cost of that, 300 pounds a ton of CO2 captured, for example, we think that we can do BECCS for less than 100, right? So significantly lower cost, right? And you ask the question, so what needs to happen in order for this to become real? And I guess first point I would say is the technology is real, it is functioning, and it isn't. I would agree it's not being done widely at scale, but it is being done at scale at specific plants. So there's a plant called Petronova in the US, which is capturing about 1.5 million tons of CO2 a year, which is, again, where each of our 4 units, we would aim to capture 4 million tons. So similar order of magnitude, right? So the technology is there. We've been actually deploying pilots at the Drax power station. We've got 2 that are successfully capturing a ton a day. So again, much smaller, but actually using the technology on biomass flue gas is something we need to validate, and that's actually happening. And we would expect to go into a sort of series of phases. We're in a pre-feed phase now, feed studies next year to be ready to start investing in earnest in 2023. Right? But the other side of this is that there's real need for government and private sector partnership. And I think of this as a great analog to the offshore wind story, a situation where a technology that would be first of its kind in terms of doing biomass with carbon capture and storage at scale. Government sort of support for this to give confidence in the revenue model. And I absolutely agree with the idea this is about using the government balance sheet to enable private capital to be deployed. It's just in the same way it's been done before. So we need the right support mechanism, and we've been working with BEIS and the government on this to actually sort of look at how we can enable carbon capture and storage. Right? The second key piece of this, and again, I think an area where government involvement is absolutely appropriate, is in actually doing the infrastructure. So building infrastructure, carbon capture and storage infrastructure around the UK. The government is working with clusters at the moment to do that. So we're part of something called Zero Carbon Humber. And actually we're going to be, again, our hope is to we're going to be submitting a proposal to get grant funding from the government over the course of the rest of this year. And again, with the idea that we would have a carbon capture and storage infrastructure, either pipeline and offshore storage, available by 2027 to actually start doing this in earnest, right? So I think all the pieces are sort of the known pieces. They need to be put together in a new way. And actually, if we ultimately end up with a scenario, which what I like is if government enables multiple clusters to do carbon and capture and storage, so you have competing clusters, as it were, but you need several of them. And then actually the real competition will be between different companies that want to capture CO2 in those clusters, right? And you can organize a similar structure that they've had with offshore wind to do annual auctions. And over time, I would expect the cost of CCS to come down in similar ways as has happened with other technologies, right? So I think it's something that it will take a while for it to be done at scale on a broad basis, but the best time I think to start is now, right? Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you, Will. I'm going to go straight into questions because we're getting a lot coming through from people who are watching. So the first one is from Rachel Nunn, and she asks, would introducing a new carbon tax have a role to play? So a lot of academics and policymakers increasingly talking about the need to have a consistent carbon tax across different economic sectors. Rhian-Mari, what do you think to that?
I think the answer, in short, is yes. And the reason I say that so confidently is we've recently authored a white paper, the Commission on Zero Carbon, which puts forward to government a case for a £75 carbon tax per tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent to be reached by 2030, which takes into account the different taxes we already have in different sectors. Clearly, a tax acting on its own can't actually transform the economy. If we did, then the fuel tax would have already meant we were all driving electric cars. So we need to be smarter about it. But importantly, by having a differentiated tax by sector and thinking very clearly about how we redistribute that tax, making sure, for example, the Minister mentioned energy efficiency of homes earlier, by making sure that we redeploy some of this tax directly in addressing fuel poverty and addressing the retrofitting of homes. We not only help decarbonize the economy and spur more innovation, but we also importantly bring consumers and the electorate with us on that journey, which is obviously a critical piece of the puzzle here.
Katerina, people have been, you've been writing about the environment, as you say, for a long time. People have been talking about carbon tax. Politically very difficult, right?
Politically extremely difficult, as there have been many examples, in France obviously immediately springs to mind. But I would agree with Rhian-Mari that it has an appropriate price on carbon has to be part of the solution.
Great. Professor Allwood.
Before we move to the 100% target, then the carbon tax was a helpful idea for changing the relative prices of things. But actually, now that we've gone to zero emissions, it's not so clear that it's the right mechanism, because we don't want to adjust the prices between things. We want to get rid of carbon completely. So I think what Rhian-Mari said about it perhaps being a stage on the way makes good sense to me. But actually, I think we require regulation. The electric cars have come about by regulation. And we need the same thing on domestic heating and a timeline for that and so on. So it's possible that it's too late for the carbon price to do the thing that we've been talking about, but which hasn't happened because it's been so politically intractable.
Great. I might come to another question, which is from Rachel Nunn, and I'm going to direct this to Will, which is, can carbon capture be compatible with the United Nations Social Development Goals?
Okay. I'm just going to jump in quickly on the carbon tax question before I get into that one. But to me, the interesting thing about a carbon tax, and I don't disagree with the idea that regulation taxes sort of needs to be a combination of approaches to this, because that's, I think, again, if you look back at the way that the power sector is decarbonized, I think that there's been it's been a combination of things in the UK that has allowed that to happen. But one of the things I think is really interesting is if a negative carbon tax, as it were, a carbon tax credit, were given to those people that are actually reducing or capturing CO2, delivering negative emissions, I think then you end up with effectively a system which will more quickly and more cheaply decarbonize, because effectively you've got sort of both sides of the market playing more effectively than if it was only people actually having to pay a carbon tax. So I think there's really interesting ideas there. So in terms of the UN Social Development Goals, in terms of CO2, carbon capture, a couple of different points I would make there. If I think about why are we using carbon capture and storage, I think what we're trying to do is get to negative emissions. So, for example, we think that sort of goes beyond maybe some of the ideas that carbon capture has had in the past, which is maybe perceived as trying to sort of keep fossil fuel emissions alive, as it were. I think it's much more about how do we decarbonize at the lowest cost. Right? So if you end up putting in place a competitive system, I think then we can actually get real CO2 emissions from it. So I think that's okay. I think if we think about in terms of the sort of social agenda, if you think about the zero carbon humber, there, we have the opportunity by putting in carbon capture and storage infrastructure there to not only save a lot of existing jobs, so I think it helps with the sort of leveling up agenda and sort of making sure we bring people along in a just transition sort of context. I mean, there's about 55,000 heavy industry jobs that we think would continue if they were decarbonized in the Humber through carbon capture and storage. And the other side of that is helping to enable what Kwasi was talking about earlier, which is the hydrogen economy. Right? I mean, I think over time we will end up, we'll start, I expect with blue hydrogen, i.e. making hydrogen with power where you need to capture some CO2 to make it sort of carbon neutral, and then overall move to green. So carbon capture and storage can enable a lot of new parts of the economy as well. So I think there's lots of benefits from carbon capture and storage.
Great, and I should just mention at this point, as it's an opportunity to plug Bright Blue work, that we did a report called Pressure in the Pipeline last year, so do look at that, because it looked at the role of low carbon gas, so particularly looking at hydrogen, which is being trialled at the moment in home heating, and how we might be able to scale that up. So please do look at that. Rhian-Mari, you wanted to come in.
I just wanted to make a final point on this carbon tax. I think we've all said something quite similar in that it is obviously not a panacea, and it needs to be done thoughtfully to make sure that its redistributive mechanisms are supporting innovation and also supporting the consumer. But from purely a finance perspective, as we try and pivot and deploy capital more towards the technologies of the future rather than the technologies of the last century, one of the challenges is actually having a set of forward-looking scenarios and assumptions underpinning cash flows of some of these different industries. And I do think actually having a clear trajectory and a clear signal on a carbon tax would actually provide a clear input for investors and for lenders in actually trying to understand how different industries are going to be transitioning and pivoting. So I think it would also play a key role in that endeavour as well.
Yeah, very good point. Katerina, I just wanted to come to carbon capture again. It's just like with the Carbon Pact, CCUS has been talked about as for a long time as something which will be really critical to achieving net zero. But obviously it's still very nascent. I mean, what's your view on that as a kind of route to net zero? Overhyped or something which is essential?
No, I don't. So I used to refer to carbon capture as the joker card that all governments kept in their pocket. So it was the thing that everybody always mentioned. It's all right, everything will be fine because we can just suck it out of the air and put it away somewhere and forget about it entirely. And the frustration, as I think Will and others have mentioned, is that we do know how to do this, but it hasn't been developed at scale. And I mean, in Britain, there have been several government stimulus ventures to try and push it to scale, and yet they've always failed. We now have a government that again is saying it's going to support carbon capture and storage, and I hope that will in fact come to be true. As Julian mentioned, you do need, this isn't an area where just setting up the right financial incentives is, or rather just relying on the market, and this may come as a surprise from somebody who works for The Economist, but just relying on market mechanisms isn't going to get you there. You do need the government to get involved. And so I guess it's a bit of a mixed answer. I don't think it's a pipe dream. I think it's a necessary part of getting to net zero. I think if we'd started properly mitigating 15 years ago, it might not have been. But we are where we are now. And so today it is a necessary part of the mix. But it's not just going to happen on its own.
Great. So, Professor Allwood, there's a question here for you from Andrew Lowe, who asks, is it Professor Allwood's view that most politicians, as with the public, don't grasp how much new tech will be required to reach net zero? Perhaps good that the minister has now left us.
I actually think the opposite. I think the political establishment, the kind of climate policy community, is overexcited about new technologies because they can't grasp the reality of deployment. So naming something has become the same as it existing at global scale and having replaced everything that was there before. So I feel that my job as an engineer is to keep saying, well, wait a minute, you can't actually do it that fast. And I thought Will's description of the BECCS project at Drax was fantastic. That if everything goes according to the plan Will set out, which would be a world first for civil engineering, they never stick to the plan, but if it did, then they're going to start the investment in 2023. These 16 million tonnes will occur sometime later. Let's be ambitious and say you could build it and get it operating in 10 years. And that is ambitious because currently there's no storage. That would be about 2 to 3% of the UK's emissions. So it would be a good contribution. I really hope we do it. But actually, that's not anywhere near enough to be significant compared to getting to where we need to be by 2050. Since 1990, every single year, our cars have got heavier, our internal temperatures have gone up, the rate at which we're buying and throwing away things like buildings keeps going up. So we aren't addressing the key things that are easy to do technologically because we keep hoping for the comfort blanket, what Catherine called a joker, I think of as a comfort blanket of magic technology to take it away later, so let's not act now.
Sorry, I was just going to say, it's actually interesting that we think of carbon capture and storage as a magic technology, since it has existed and been practiced by oil companies for about a century now. And Julian just talked about this whole renaming thing. You know, you want to have a new buzzword to put out there, and that gives you a sense that you're making progress. Negative emissions is a new term that, in fact, you know, is a carbon capture and storage applied to bioenergy is basically negative emissions. So it's sort of everything's kind of, we're coming back to the same solutions, but we keep trying to progress on the same solutions and not actually get anywhere.
Great. I'm going to move on to another question, which is from Fiona Watts. And she asks, how viable is the UK's present strategy of including nuclear within the decarbonisation transition? Have moves in the market rendered it less important than it was a decade ago? Katerina, perhaps I'll come to you first on that.
I actually would have loved to hear what Kwasi Kwarteng had to say about this, because personally, I think that nuclear is one of those technologies that exists at scale and is carbon neutral, and therefore we should in fact be deploying. Now, the trend in the West is towards withdrawing nuclear, even in France, in fact, surprisingly. China is going in the opposite direction. And so I personally think that nuclear is part of the future mix, but I think that the government and societal barriers are going to need to be overcome.
Will, welcome back. I'm glad the technical issues have been sorted. Just talking about nuclear. And whether nuclear has been overhyped or not, considering moves in the market recently. Just wondering your view on nuclear.
So I always sort of hesitate to talk about nuclear because I grew up in the era of sort of 3 Mile Island in the U.S. and I think that sort of I've got, every time I think nuclear, I think Jane Fonda on the TV, and it sort of gets a little bit, I get nervous about it. But ultimately, I think if one were to think of it at very sort of basic level, nuclear technology can be part of the solution if it can deliver zero carbon power at a reasonable cost. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
I think the challenges with it are that it is the regulatory requirements and the safety requirements are such that the cost ends up being higher than I think is feasible, and I think societally it's very challenging, right? I mean, I think everything that we do to decarbonize, I think, also needs to have, a strong, license to operate, if you will, right? And frankly, I mean, I'll talk a little bit about, from a biomass perspective, that's something that we deal with every day. I mean, we need to make sure people understand what we're doing is sustainable, that we're doing the right thing for the forests, and so we share some of that challenge in terms of the way people perceive what we do. And I think that is going to be a challenge for nuclear as well.
Great. Okay, I'm going to go to a new question, which is from Alexander Stewart, and I'm going to come to Rhian-Mari for this, which is how quickly should UK export finance phase out support for fossil fuel investments? How can it provide more proactive support for renewable energy industries within the UK?
That's a great question. Thank you, Alex. I think the challenge the UK export finance is facing is the same as other financial institutions, which is the need to pivot away from familiar and now unsustainable revenue generation and look towards newer and more innovative ways of making money. I think in the case of UK export finance, there's fantastic expertise there in providing guarantee type mechanisms that support trade, and therefore there is a pretty obvious pivot to providing its guarantees for things like imports as well as exports. One of the discussions at the moment is looking at the deforestation commodities that are coming in through our import and supply chains. So providing a sustainable import guarantee, which is something that we've been pushing for at the Green Finance Institute, working with various government departments, is something that we'd very much like to see the UK Export Finance Organisation embracing and supporting again the ability to crowd in private capital. I think I'm going to die on this hill of pleading with government to use its balance sheet to actually crowd in that private capital, as we're increasingly seeing clamour in the markets to invest in ESG aligned investment. And part of the government's role is to help create that pipeline and create the conditions that will enable investors and lenders to really participate in this transition.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to plug some more Bright Blue work, which is we've just started a project looking at how you can make UK export finance better aligned with various public policy goals, including, of course, net zero. Katerina, recently UK export finance has come under fire for supporting projects like a gas pipe in Mozambique. What's your view on the future of UKEF?
So I am not a finance expert, so actually I would refer to Rhian-Mari's comments on this. But I think it's also what her points about deforestation are also interesting, and we've written at The Economist quite extensively about the importance of removing deforestation from the supply chain. And I think this is an area where Britain can potentially have real international impact on emissions abroad. And the stance of the current Brazilian government has real repercussions for the rest of the planet. And I think Britain needs to use all of its might in that area.
Great. A question which I'm going to direct to Professor Allwood is from Councillor Joe Porter, and he says, is it more environmentally and financially viable for councils and partners to build a solar farm or wind farm to address climate change and gain an income?
A very good question. I think the problem is going to be about the amount of land that we can deploy. So the reason that we've gone offshore is that it's easier to get access and to get permission there without conflicting with other land uses. With wind, you can obviously match other uses with wind, so you can have conventional farming underneath it. With solar, it's very difficult to use the land for any other purposes. So solar generates more per unit of land area, probably around about 4 to 5 times more electricity per field that was committed, but it can't be used for anything else in parallel. So it's probably harder to scale.
Great. Rhian-Mari.
I just wanted to come in. I know I'm always bringing this back to the finance, but that's what I do. And we're seeing some really interesting innovation in terms of that community finance. One of our members of our Coalition on Energy Efficient Buildings, which is Abundance Investments, have successfully launched new community municipal investments, which are effectively crowdsourcing funding from retail investors, so regular investors like us, to support local community solar panel and other projects, which I think is a really exciting development and one that we're very keen to see scaled across other local authorities up and down the country, given where, the cash-strapped situation that many local authorities find themselves in. So some really interesting innovations happening on the finance side as well as the technology side.
Great. I'm going to come to Will now because we've had a couple of questions which are probably directed to you. So Sasha Dashwick asked, the UK spends 1.5 billion subsidising wood imports burned for electricity, maybe from sensitive forests. Should UK subsidise burning trees for electricity? And there's a similar question from Rory Fink, who says, how is the planting of monocultural forests consistent with Drax commitment to safeguarding biodiversity? You're muted, Will, so you do need to unmute yourself.
Sorry. No, they're all good questions that we come up with every day, and that I think, again, making clear what we're doing is quite important. So the first thing I think is important to note is that people don't either plant or harvest forests for the purposes of making wood pellets to deliver biomass power. So everything that we use is fundamentally a byproduct of some other use of that forest. We aren't using wood from or fiber from sensitive forests. They're all managed forests, etc. And again, the fact that we're using fiber that is a byproduct of another use, I don't think it isn't fair to say that we are sort of supporting or contributing to a monocultural type of setup in terms of the way forestry should work, right? So the key thing for me is that the UK in the first instance has very strict requirements for what type of fiber we can use and how we audit that. So for example, we need to know where every one of our wood pellets come from. We need to take them only from forests that are growing. And fundamentally, let me give you an example, actually 40% of what we use is residue from a sawmill. So my own view is that the economics of forestry are such that by providing a economic value to some of the lower value parts of the sort of what comes out of a forest, we're actually supporting people to replant forests and to actually continue to manage those forests well. And we just need to continue to work in that way and sort of support growing forests. So the final point is, if you take the southeast of the US, which is where we get about 60% of our fiber from, the extent of the carbon is captured there today in the forest is about 50% higher than it was in the 1950s. So we are, again, as evidence that we're taking fiber from forests that are growing and capturing more CO2.
Okay, Katerina.
Yeah, I actually had a question for Will, if I can, which is, do you have estimates on the maximum capacity that there is to produce bioenergy like this without starting to impinge on biodiversity targets?
No, very good question, because I think that's the, when one of the questions that we've had a live discussion with Biz about is BECCS ultimately a sort of scalable and interesting technology at more than just a, UK or a Drax specific level, and we've done quite a lot of work on this. And if you start from the idea that you only are using fiber from a working forest, this is on a global scale, you're only using residuals, as I described, so byproducts of everything that happens, you are avoiding lots of areas where there are sort of issues of biodiversity, whether maybe there's sort of economic challenges or there are governance challenges, i.e. you cannot be confident you're getting what you need, then we actually think there's enough biomass to capture. Again, if you use it with carbon capture and storage, to capture all the emissions of the global aviation sector, so that could be about 4 gigatons globally, right? So now that's a macro view. So we haven't looked in the micro at what we could do, but there's no question in my mind that BECCS could play a major role on a global scale as part of a climate solution.
Okay, so we've got another question in, which is a sort of battle between different technologies question. So John Pope asks, will renewable technology like wind energy actually ever challenge the efficiency of nuclear power in powering this country? So perhaps I can go to Professor Allwood for that.
When I was at the IPCC, I fell for having my arm twisted to be one of the editors of the glossary. And efficiency was my favorite word. The Secretariat were German, so when I wrote the definition as efficiency can mean the ratio of any two quantities used for any purpose, they refused to accept it. But we can have any ratio of any numbers we want for efficiency. And I think that's a really challenging measure. By land area commitment, nuclear generates around about 1,000 watts per square meter and wind generates around 3. So by that metric of efficiency, no, there's no possible comparison. Economically, the problem with nuclear obviously is the risk, the insurer of last resort, and nobody can ever take that into the private sector. So for governments, they're always taking on an enormous and incalculable risk, and I would say that's an inefficiency. I'm not quite sure what the other metrics are, but the other key comparison is that nuclear output is kind of constant, whereas wind and solar output is obviously intermittent when the wind blows, when the sun shines. And it would be a great advantage to us to have some more baseload of the type of nuclear to deal with the problems when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing.
And then just as a sort of follow-up to that, David Dundas asks, conventional nuclear technology is expensive, but alternatives such as molten salt reactors are safer and less costly. So why are they not deployed at scale?
Very briefly, I'm not an expert, but the industry is obviously lobbying for small and medium-sized reactors at the moment, and it would suit Rolls-Royce very well if that market developed, because obviously aviation, fossil-powered aviation has to shut in the next 30 years, so they're going to have no market. But we haven't tested public acceptance of it. So it seems to me that SMR-type small nuclear technologies is one we urgently need one demonstrator to find out how we'll get on living with it. Is it something we accept societally, or is it something that we just don't want to touch and we don't know until we try it out?
Okay, so I'm just going to ask the panel to wrap up now. So I'm going to ask a final question to everybody. And if you could keep your answer short, that would be great, because we will be cut off very soon. And this is, what more, do we adopt this sort of neutral approach that Kwasi was mentioning, which is, we don't know which technologies are going to be most successful, so let's support and cultivate as many as possible? Or do you think actually we need to be doing much more for particular types of technology in the quest for net zero? So I'll start with Will. Again, you need to unmute yourself, Will.
Sorry. In order to enable some technologies like carbon capture, the government will need to take a position and enable that, right? And that is a function of infrastructure, and it's a function of the support mechanisms required. And if I just sort of answer one question which has come up, which is why hasn't carbon capture and storage worked in the past? My own view on that is because it does cost money, and someone's going to have to pay for it. But to take Rhian's view, if there was a carbon tax of £70, right, i.e., if you actually captured CO2 and didn't have to pay that tax, and society, in the UK, we thought that was a price that we should pay to decarbonize, we could do it. No question.
Thank you. Rhian-Mari.
I think one of the things we've heard on this in this panel has been the need to scale up the technologies that we have. And so I'm going to go with that point in my closing remark and say, as much as a new national investment bank could pull through some of these future technologies, for the existing technologies, we have existing financial technology to match, which is the ability for the UK government in the run-up to COP to issue a green sovereign bond that we could use to finance some of the technologies that are in existence and show global leadership as all eyes of the world are on the UK as hosts of the United Nations conference next year. So call to government, green sovereign bond at scale in order to help speed up the deployment of some of our existing technologies.
Professor Allwood.
Thank you. We should be going for all technologies possible, but we have to recognise the difference between those that are very early stage and R&D scale and those which really are ready for mass deployment. So until they're achieving something like 10% market share, they're an R&D project. From then on, we can explore rapid expansion. So we must develop everything, but we can't expect new technologies, and everything to do with CCUS or negative emissions technologies are new technologies. They're nowhere near significant scale. they aren't going to be significant by 2050. So we've got to go crazy with what already works, and while developing those to make life easier after we've hit the zero emissions target in 2050.
And final words to you, Katerina.
So I think that the time for exploring everything under the sun has passed, and people talk about climate change as requiring a complete revolution, a Marshall Plan in our society, and you don't do that with crazy, shiny new ideas that don't exist yet. And so we need to be doing the things that exist, that we know how to do. I actually would include carbon capture and storage in that bucket. But I think it's very important to focus on what we know we can do and can work at scale to help solve this problem. It seems crazy to me to turn our backs on things that we know can work and chase something else that's shiny over there.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you again to Drax for partnering with us on the event. We're very grateful. The minister did leave halfway through and he sends his apologies for that, but just to say that his team was watching this event and taking notes. So I hope that provides reassurance that government is definitely listening to what was a very interesting and rich and thoughtful discussion. Just to say that Bright Blue is hosting more Fringe events in this tent. The details of the next one will be appearing just after this event. So a virtual round of applause to the speakers. Thank you very much.